very good morning to all. I guess we are here in a very changed environment. In one way, it's very exciting to talk to you all over the webinar today. But the core of hospitality is missing. The fundamental ethos of hospitality was always to network, meet people, be present, customer engagement, student engagement. And more importantly, I think what was important for us was always to socialize. What COVID has done today is actually fundamentally challenge the ethos of hospitality. So with that, I would start in terms of how we are adapting, what the industry is doing in India and abroad, and as students and as future citizens in the economy, what are the few things that you need to look at in terms of ensuring that you're ready skilling yourself. I think the term upskilling is gone. I think the term ready skilling has now come into place. So I think COVID-19 is not anymore a novel subject. I think we've been hearing this for the last 75 to 90 days. And I think we are actually hearing more than what we should actually be hearing. That's the power of technology today. Whether it is right, whether it is wrong, whether it's true, whether it's false, every information kind of reaches us in one form or the other. It is up to us to basically dissect and see what happens with it. But COVID-19 is the crisis of a lifetime. In terms of the hospitality sector, it is the Armageddon of the hospitality sector. It is wiping out the good, the bad, the ugly. And the best part of it is this crisis has not put any distinction to whom it has been wiping out. Predominantly in the previous economic cycles and previous economic slowdowns that you would see, that the impact is generally felt by a few people who are unable to cope up with it, or people who are basically at the bottom line of sustenance. But this Armageddon is hitting everybody, the good, the bad, the ugly, the players in every single sector of hospitality today. So I want to quote one of my mentors in hospitality world, Mr. Sir Arne Sorensen. Sir Arne Sorensen is basically the head of Marriott. That is also the largest hospitality company in the world. Predominantly, they are policymakers in most of the countries they go to in terms of where hospitality is heading on to and what the global trends are. And I remember Sir Arne Sorensen talking to us about a month and a half, 2 months ago. At that time, he explained this pandemic to have an impact of the 9/11 attack in America and 2008 economic slowdown in the world. He said the pandemic 75 days ago had that impact across the world. Now, that was 75 days ago. The last 75 days, we are even unable to measure in terms of what the depth of this crisis is in hospitality. In a lot of ways, I think hospitality is greatly affected because of the way we function. We always had fixed costs at a very high level. We also ensured that there was always a brick and mortar business being brought into the hospitality industry. So it was always a heavy business to get into. And one of the fundamental thoughts that most entrepreneurs like me had was that disruption never touched hospitality. If you see what happened 50 years ago to what is happening now in hospitality, the changes in hospitality is very, very minimal. You had the same guest engagement cycle about 50 years ago. And today, it's predominantly similar in terms of how the guest engagement cycle works. So, people may argue that hospitality never went through a disruption part in the first place for us to ensure that we are business ready when this pandemic eventually gets over. And I think they're quite right. I think they are very right in saying that this business needed a change, this business needed a disruption. And maybe COVID-19 has only hastened the already festering sentiments that this hospitality segment needs a reboot, needs to restart, and needs to have a bigger disruption coming into play as a whole industry per se, and not bits and pieces here and there. So I think what this crisis has done in the last 90 days, it's pushed all stakeholders to the boardroom. We look at management companies like Marriott, like the Intercontinentals, like the Radissons, and like the Anantaras and the Accor. We are also looking at hotel owners who have invested billions and billions of dollars in basically creating the brick and mortar asset that they wanted to do. We are looking at franchises. A lot of companies in Europe, Americas, and the Far East basically franchise brands. And it also has got people like us who are operating companies to go back to the drawing board and start refiguring out on how we are able to come out of this crisis, distinguish ourselves, and make a distinct disruption in the market. The sector by itself is expected to see a very protracted recovery cycle. So generally, the recovery cycle of most recessions will start between 18 to 24 months. And again, necessity is what drives all that. But hospitality, unfortunately, is always the first sector to get hit when a crisis happens. And it's also the last sector that is going to bounce back when a crisis ends. So, you've got a double whammy in hospitality. Last to recover and first to get affected. So when you have those two components coming in, the recovery cycle automatically tends to become much more longer than what it is for a regular sector. Hotels today are likely to come back operating at 30% or 25% or 15% of their yearly revenues is what they had in 2017. And the reason why I say 2017 is because that was one of the moderate years in world hospitality, especially Indian hospitality. 2019 was one of the boom years of Indian hospitality as well as world hospitality. So it is quite difficult to benchmark a great year, and it's always good to benchmark an average year on how the recovery is going to take place. So you've got two very big costs in hospitality. So you've got one, your fixed costs, and the other, your payroll costs. These two are very people's business. Most owners today are stuck with these two costs, which are fixed in nature, and which is why you see total panic in the market when it comes to layoffs of people in the hospitality sector, or consistently driving defaults and debts of people who've leveraged their assets and built these assets based on debt that had taken from the outside market or financial institutions. So I think fundamentally, today, whatever recovery we are going to see in the next 30 or 45 days, it's going to be more in the lines of having a band-aid for a hemorrhage. It seldom is going to protect the business in any form or manner. The hemorrhage has already occurred. So I guess now looking for a band-aid to basically solve it is the wrong way to go. And that's what most operators like ourselves and the top brands in the world are realizing, that it's now time to look at a fundamental change and just not optical changes that we are all quite used to from the last recession in 2008. So I think fundamentally, what hotels today are looking at is talking about how do we use human capital. That's deployed, that's there. Brick and mortar is something which cannot be leveraged to a certain degree in this particular scenario. So everybody is trying to look at in terms of how are we going to drive human capital to achieve greater efficiency today, post-COVID, and at a stage when we've got to move into a scenario where the fundamentals of hospitality have completely changed. So I'll give you a classic example today. So generally, when I've done a few of these mentor talks, when I've done a few of these corporate talks, I've gone to universities. So generally, the cycle of economy and hospitality works like this. I take a taxi to the airport. I buy a coffee at the airport. I fly to the city that I want to go speak to. A car picks me up. Generally, I stay in a hotel for a night. I meet the students. I talk to them for half an hour, 45 minutes. That extends into a networking session over lunch or dinner as and when applicable. Then the reverse transactions start. I come back to the airport with a taxi, take a flight back to Hyderabad, take a taxi, come back home. So that's probably, you're looking at 12 to 13 transactions that I would have done what I'm not doing today. Consider billions of transactions like this on a daily basis. And that is the humongous effect that this crisis is having on the hospitality sector. So if one person is looking at about 11 transactions average in a travel, you have close to 1 billion people traveling. And that's 11 billion transactions. That includes your restaurant transactions, that includes every facets of hospitality that you'd have chosen to in some form or the other. Today, that's extinct, or rather, I wouldn't call it extinct. I think it's on a pause mode today, with nobody understanding in terms of how fast and what's going to come out in the market first to begin with. So I think networking and meeting was one of the fundamental reasons why universities, colleges, internships, etc., drove corporates like us to meet you guys. Now, that has changed dramatically. For me, it is about not able to meet you guys, not able to talk to you all, not able to see you in person. But on your side, your networking ability and your ability to transact business with corporates has far receded. The opportunity to make a mark in front of people, the opportunity to be able to sell your skills to a set of corporates is gone. Although not gone indirectly, it has gone directly in terms of your face value on how we want to do it. Now, that's a transformation I would like you to think about in terms of how you, as students, are going to adapt to the future in being able to ensure that you're right skilling. I will talk about this right skilling later when I actually come to the post-COVID situation. So every sector in hospitality is going through this grind. Although a few sectors like us, I mean, we run a student living and a co-living business. We've got close to about 10,000 beds in India. And I think we are fairly insulated from this crisis simply because of the fact that we come under the essential services, and people who have to go to work or people who are forced to stay somewhere and do work are forced to stay in a place that they feel is the right place to basically be in. So there are very few arms of hospitality business that is basically shielded from this whole crisis, and those can be counted with your fingers. I mean, it's that little that it has not impacted. Or when I say not impacted in full. We have a tremendous impact, but for a hospitality company in a normal sector like a hotels, they have 100% impact. In a co-living business like Isthara, we might have possibly a 40% impact or a 50% impact. But things are changing. So what can we do during COVID? One part of it is basically say, fine, the crisis has happened, there's helplessness all over. What are we going to do? We've got to do something. Just by saying that the crisis is there, the crisis is not going to run away anywhere. And I think it's time for us to relook at what we are doing to ensure that, one, we are mitigating this crisis as much as we can. But most importantly, what are the lessons that we are learning from this crisis to ensure that when we eventually come out of this crisis, that we are business ready? In our cases, we have plans on how to be business ready. You as students, do you have plans to ensure you're employable ready? And I think that's something that you've got to ask yourself in terms of what are the dynamic changes that every industry is bringing into ourselves. So, there's a very famous saying of Ruskin Bond, and I want to quote that. It's in times of crisis, it's wonderful to see what the imagination will do. And I think that's a great quote, very apt for the discussion today, because, we are in a crisis. How do we want our imaginations to flow? Do we want that to go into a very constructive, result-oriented, future-ready kind of an imagination? Or are we going to be sitting around and saying, well, the crisis has come, we are all helpless and we shall continue to be helpless? I think that power of imagination lies with you. And I think that power of imagination is quite critical, that it's harnessed so that today, if you're looking at us as business, there are three parts that we look at. We look at austerity, obviously cutting costs and making sure that our costs are in line with what we are making as revenue, are in line or at par, so that we are not basically losing money in unnecessary costs. Then we're looking at inventiveness. How are we trying to reinvent our business? We've all been running a race which was very, 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 very fast in the last 1 decade. So this is basically a pause time to say, hold on, we are here, we've reached this crisis. Do we want to take some time off and look at how we are going to nurture those inventiveness in everybody's fabric? And I think that's a great opportunity for us to relook at how are we going to reinvent things? How are we going to look at new ways of doing things? And how are we going to get to adaptability much faster than what other people can? And the third important point is adaptation. I think it's a beautiful word, easier said than done. I think when we look at adaptation, uh, it's easy to say we are adaptable. It's very easy to say we can do this, we can do that. The tougher part and the tougher question is basically we as ourselves and as businesses, how fast are we adapting to the particular situation that's more macro in nature? We have very little control of what is happening today. Most of us, I think all of us today, are in a situation that we can't directly impact these macro changes. How are we as entrepreneurs? How are we as businesses? How are we as hospitality players like us? And how are we as students like you adapting to this changed environment of normalcy? So I think during the COVID crisis, Isthara Co-Living had certain objectives that we wanted to achieve, which we set out in very early March when the crisis broke out, and said, probably this 50 to 60 days is going to give us some ways to look at in terms of how we're going to do business in future. So what we did was we started using human capital efficiently. And whichever company that you're talking about, they keep talking to you about this human capital, which is a wonderful thing. That's the power that any company can harness, where they've already put in the certain cost that they can. It is also a great time to clean up our standard operating procedures and work on basically adapting to the new models. Why standard operating procedures needs to be refreshed? I think in most businesses, including hospitality, we look at a situation where standard operating procedures always existed, but the pace of business was always so hard that you never had the time to relook at the standard operating procedures and adapt it. For example, in a business like hotels in the last 50 years have moved away from a conversation of telegrams and telex today to facial recognition and check-in without keys and check-in without people. Now, how do you define that kind of level of hospitality when you basically say our ethos were always in terms of meeting people, but now we're going to introduce machines to you and not people anymore? And I guess that's a fundamental shift, that the thought process of the consumer and the thought process of the service provider dramatically changes. So your SOPs needs adjusting to these lines. It needs to start going in lines of what the future is. And it's quite important that adaptability of these SOPs are done in line when you have the time to do it, such as today. It also looks at what is an ideal overlap in terms of a normal offering. So you had the austerity, you had the inventiveness, and you had the adaptability. Today, these are the three key words that this crisis has precipitated in the hospitality industries. So when you put these together, you always have a certain area where there is an overlap. So how much of that overlap does your business need, or how much of that overlap do you as students need, is something for you to answer. That overlapping factor is called the value factor. And people generally who have created that value to a different level are likely to benefit better when this whole crisis is over. So use this time to look at the three wheels again and see how that overlaps and how that value is created by you in terms of what we do. So our value, what we looked at in Isthara in the hospitality sector, is definitely human capital. We looked at time for SOPs. We looked at how far we are able to drive this value in terms of how big it can contribute to the future. It is also a right time to plan and adjust for new revenue streams. Is everything going to be normal in 60 days and 90 days? And are you going to have the same tourists coming back to India? Religious tourism, we have fun tourism, we have medical tourism. Are these all likely to come back in 90 days? No, it's not going to. The world has fundamentally changed. Today, the challenge is fundamentally different to what it was 6 months ago. In 6 months ago, everybody talked about open borders. Everybody talked about tourism dollars. Everybody talked about how we can move people from one place to another and make the money out of them by they seeing your country. Today, every country in this world has literally shut down. We don't want people from outside coming in. Americans don't want anybody coming in here. Indians don't want anybody coming in here. Every single country has insulated themselves from the outside world. Are they going to go back tomorrow and say, yeah, we are back to normal, everything is hunky-dory, please come back? No, it's not going to be happening. And it's foolish to think that it will go back to that normalcy in the very near future. There's going to be a lot of restrictions again in terms of how travel is dictated, how various policies of travels are dictated. And this is only going to compound to the fact that the business recovery of hospitality is going to take that much more longer. We also need to look at threats of these revenue streams in future. So if you were an airline company and you had invested heavily into this, and suddenly you're unable to do cross-border flights, and you're not able to do long-haul flights simply because of the fact that the countries would not allow you to, if you continue to put your energy and if you continue to put your thoughts in terms of how that money is going to come back, it's foolishness. No, we know it's going to go away. We know that revenue stream is not going to happen the same way it was before. And for you to fool yourself and say, I'm going to go back to this business model is not at all prudent. So we have to relook as an industry in terms of what are the adapted revenue streams for business. So for all you MBAs who are basically in the college, look at it in terms of how your supply and demand has changed. There is a dramatic change in supply and demand. And that needs to be understood for us to make sure that the business model that we are adapting for the future is changed accordingly. So what do we see as post-COVID? You know, we've talked about what the industry is today. We've talked about what during COVID that we could do. Let's also talk about what we could do post-COVID. I said the opportunity that we have post-COVID is great. I think if we look at it in terms of what the biggest opportunity is, lack of disruptions. I've said this before, hospitality, except for a couple of fleeting experiments, except for a couple of fleeting glances of what disruption could look like, fundamentally has not been disrupted. If you look at e-commerce, if you look at banking, if you look at any other sectors, in terms of automation, in terms of mechanization, in terms of artificial intelligence, a lot of things have changed. Even the airline industry has gone through a dramatic shift from what it was 30 years ago to what it is today. The only industry that has not changed are hotels. So is this the right time to disrupt? I definitely think so. We had some very minuscule examples. We had the experiment of Airbnb. We had Oyo that came into play. We had some great aggregators who came into play. We had low-cost economy flights that came into play. So all this were basically triggers in terms of disruptions to a certain degree. But by far, the industry has not changed. So as a student who wants to go into the job market, I think you would have always heard the words upskill. You would have always heard the word in terms of better skills, etc., etc. I think those words mean slightly different today. It is no longer about you upskilling your skills for you to be future ready, especially in hospitality. I think the word right skill has come into play. And what do I mean by right skill? What I mean by right skill is looking at the future in terms of what are the skill sets that are going to be relevant after all this crisis is over. A lot of skills are out of the window today. For all the people who prided on customer management, for all the people who talked about how great I am in managing customer experiences, for all those people who said I'm a smooth talker, I'm a great salesperson, I can meet people, networking is my fundamental strength. It's time for you all to relook at where you are today. It's time to right skill, because networking of future is not going to be the same as networking of what was happening 45 days to 75 days ago. The same thing with sales. Is have a person in front of me and I can sell anything you want was one of the attributes of successful salespeople in the past. That ain't happening anymore. Face-to-face calls, meeting people is going to get tougher and tougher and tougher unless and until this crisis runs away very quick. Even if the crisis runs away very quick, the after effects of these crises in terms of distancing measures are there to stay. So that's again a huge change that it's being brought across to the hospitality as well as to every other sector. Then we look at places such as workspaces. Today, work from home, wherever you read, Economic Times, etc., etc., there's always these abbreviations of WFH, work from home. What does it really mean? Is it going to be the future? Not necessarily. I think the way we see it in hospitality is work from home has existed in the past. Quite a lot of industries had that in the past as a very successful attempt. Is that likely to stay? It is likely to increase from what it was before. But the infrastructure requirements, etc., and the security aspects of making sure people are working in a safer environment, not in terms of personal safety, but more in terms of data safety, is always going to get people back to the offices. So at that stage, are we business ready in terms of making sure these policies that we've learned in these few months is effectively put into use and it's rolled out to them? After right skilling, the second big aspect is technology. Most disruptions that have happened today and most disruptions that we see coming in play has always had a technology angle to it. In hospitality, it's a great time for people to embrace and develop new technologies. As I've said, in the last 50 days, hospitality has generally been thrusted with any small technologies that were already introduced. In a big way, there was not very much of technologies that was ever used in hospitality. So whether you walk into a Taj hotel, or whether you walked into an Oberoi's, whether you walked into a Radisson, or whether you walked into an Intercontinental or a Marriott, technology did not play a very crucial role in their business model ever. It always used to be human. It always used to be engagement and transactions. That is changed. So for all you technology buffs who want to do something in disrupting this, now is the right time for you to use technology at a disruption of hospitality. How can you do it? The hospitality cycle is huge. I was just talking to you about 11 potential transactions that I would have had in coming and meeting you personally. Any part of those 11 technology transactions is a disruption. Me talking to you on the Google Hangout today is a disruption. How has Zoom come into play and how has Zoom grown is a disruption. Is that the future of conferences? I think so too. Smaller conferences, smaller board meetings, which used to be personal in nature, hotels hosting them. I think those are all bygones. And I think most companies today, if you look at it, are going to look at more and more in terms of online and making efficient use of technologies that are there with us. In the near future, I think there is also a big role that robotics can bring into hospitality. There's always this beautiful video that used to circulate in the social media a couple of years ago. And we looked at a drone in America serving pizzas from Domino's. At that time, it was a great story for everybody to say, wow, that's great. A drone is going to serve pizzas. Well, is it really efficient? Is it really cost effective, etc., etc.? Guess what? We have been forced to put ourselves into a situation that now becomes a reality. So are you going to see drones coming and delivering stuff to you from tomorrow? Maybe, maybe not. There are a few countries which are far ahead in basically doing this model. There's a lot of manufacturing companies who have successfully used robotics to get this platform up and running. So is that the future? I definitely think so. I definitely think robotics and technology is going to start making a lot more impact in the hospitality in the form of supply chain management, deliveries, and more importantly, places like housekeeping, places like security, places like reservations, places like room service, etc. Every single transaction of this in hospitality had a human component to it. And that human component was basically there to ensure that that's touching the customer. But that's fundamentally changing. So are we going to be looking at more machine cleaning? I think so. Are we looking at more disruptions through technology and security? Artificial intelligence, facial recognition, they're all here already. It is just about how an entrepreneur in you can use this technology to give a solution to hospitality industry. When we check in, when we ask for a room key, Do we need to meet a person behind, or can we talk to a machine and take it? It's up to you to decide. As you know, as students, it's your time to disrupt. It's your time to ensure that this technology is taken and disrupted. Then we are looking at a few other bigger parts of hospitality. I'm not sure how many of you have been to places like Macau. These are huge MICE hotels. What I mean by MICE is, these destinations were created to host thousands and thousands and thousands of people under one roof. For example, we had a hotel, or rather, my previous employers had a hotel in Macau called the Intercontinental Macau. It had close to about 1,100 rooms. And it prided on 30,000 people, 20,000 people being accommodated in their ballrooms, so that the worldwide conferences can happen there. That's an experience center for most people. It's huge, humongous hotels like that, which have been built on the entire island of Macau. You had various casinos. Casinos needed people. Everything was so centric about people coming together. What has COVID done today? It's pushed people apart. Fundamentally, 360 difference, fundamentally a 180 degrees change in terms of how business was conducted before and how business is being conducted today. So, are we seeing the likelihood in the next few years for all these 50,000 people to gather under one roof? No, not at all. What happens to the billions of dollars that's been invested in those assets? Well, he has two choices. Give it back, declare bankruptcy, which most entrepreneurs will not, or find newer ways to utilize that assets. And this is where I think technology and innovation can come into play. People can start relooking at and looking at, well, you have the asset, what can we use it for better? And I think that's a thought process that needs to be striking with most of the entrepreneurs and from students like you in terms of how are we going to disrupt this? We have this asset. If I'm going to go across to an owner and say, hey, listen, you've got a multi-billion-dollar asset. I've got something with me as inventiveness or something which I have created, which does not give you a 100% solution, but it creates a revenue stream for you or creates a certain level of eliminating the pain point for you. Trust me, today, every single owner is looking for that person who can solve this pain point, especially after investing billions of dollars in creating this brick and mortar exercises. So this is where entrepreneurship comes from. I think Gen Z, you guys were already fantastic in making sure that you had a very entrepreneurial bug in you guys. A lot of you all always wanted to be an entrepreneur in your life. Beautiful times to be an entrepreneur. Fantastic times. As much as they say COVID is a crisis, I for one person in hospitality, I look at it as an excellent opportunity to make sure that that bedrock is created for a stronger future. So for all you future entrepreneurs, come to the party now. This is the time to come to hospitality. This is the time to disrupt, whether it is direct hospitality or indirect hospitality or technology disruptions for hospitality or any other inventiveness that you can touch play with hospitality. This complete segment worth billions and billions and billions of dollars on a turnover on a monthly basis is begging for entrepreneurs to come in with new ideas, new ways of doing business, and new forms of technology that's going to disrupt the way this hospitality business was ever running. And then we look at dynamic adaptability. Things are fast changing. I think what happened about 30 days ago to where we are today is changed. Where we are today to where we will be 30 days later is going to change. I think this change is the only constant that we are looking at for the foreseeable future. Are we likely to understand in terms of what the government is going to put out as policies? Is social distancing norms likely to go away any time in the near future? I don't think so. I really don't think any of that is going to run away in the near future unless until a vaccine is created, 7 billion people are vaccinated, etc., etc. Even that is not an exercise which is going to happen in the near future. There are certain things which are there for it to be adapted to. And I think this is where this dynamic adaptability comes into place. So I think it's quite important that we embrace this as quickly as we can. Uh, let's make those business plans as clearly as possible to ensure that we are looking at an angle where our business adaptability or our dynamic adaptability is not putting a threat to our future sustenance. Then there is always another thought of basically saying, that when I opened it, I said how heavy a fixed cost of a sector this hospitality is. Oyo and Airbnb were very successful models in basically ensuring that these models were created to more lightweight, more variable cost models. Again, the challenge is to basically ensure more and more of these sectors come into play where it is not very fixed cost oriented, but it's more variable cost oriented. So yeah, innovative business models. We need to look at those traditional fixed costs which are going to go away. And where does this bring us back to? Inventiveness of how we want to do business in future. And I guess going back to it, it all goes back to the fundamental ethos that I was mentioning to say business has changed. Adaptability and efficiency is now going to be the key points. Shared resources, the norm. Are we going to have one general manager running 5? Are we going to have one production manager managing 5 production houses? Are we going to have a great HR manager not looking at one particular business, but looking after 5 different businesses? Now, shared resources is here to stay. Why is that? Because that's a part of the fixed costs that companies want to give away today. So take Isthara, for example. We had fundamentally changed our business in the last 45 days. So where are the salespeople today in terms of businesses? They are more into receivables. They are looking at receivables as well. They are looking at various aspects where they are into multi-skilling and not opposed to just one skill for which they were actually hired to do. So we're looking at various models of how these shared resources are going to work in future too. So whether we are looking at an automated check-in process, are we going to be looking at various forms of clubbing and various roles into one? You're going to see a lot more of this coming in, and you're going to be seeing a situation where one resource controls multiple aspects of multiple businesses opposed to what we look at today. So today we are talking about what? We are talking about how good are we in one particular arm of our industry. We are talking about expertise in our domain, etc., etc. Are these vital? Are these relevant? Definitely, yes, these are vital, these are relevant. But if you look at where the future is, it's more in terms of how is that one resource shared by multiple people. So in hospitality, if we turn around and look at in terms of how we want to do it, do we want a facilities management company managing our services? Do we want our caterer to be different? Do we want our housekeeping guy to be different? Do we want our security team to be different? Do we want to manage all these aspects under us? And have a person to manage that, or are we going to give it away to experts and let them manage it as a part of their businesses so the cost structures are saved dramatically? And I think more and more you look at it, it's going to go into the direction of shared resources. It's going to be getting companies, be it colleges, be it institutions, be it the Amazons, be it the Microsofts, they are not going to start doing anything which they don't want to look at. And I'll give you an example of today in Economic Times. Today is a sad day for Airbnb. They laid off close to about 2,000 people. 2,000 people from A&B out of a total of 7,500 staff were laid off. Not furloughed, laid off, which meant that they've already taken away about 25-30% of their workforce that has been made redundant. Again, not furloughed, but redundant. So when you're looking at about 25-30% of their business being done, what is the first thing that they did? They turned around and said, let's stick to our core. Our core is to aggregate great places for people to stay. All the investments that we wanted to do in other arms like hotels, like facility management, like creating different centers, that's all gone out of the window. Said we're going to go back to our basics, stick to our basics at this time and move forward. So we do see people like Amazon, we do see people like the universities, the colleges going back and saying, how did we operate in the past? Is education our business or is hospitality our business? And more of these people are going to go back and say, we want to stick to what we're doing. We will save some costs by letting the other people come in and do this so that on an overall perspective, these resources are shared. Community living will evolve. So what I mean by saying community living is, I think the resources of shared learning, the resources of shared using, the shared market already existed in India. The rental market already existed in India. 2, 3 years ago, you had a huge number of corporates that's setting into play, right from furniture companies to two-wheelers. Your Vogo bikes or your bounce bikes were all an example of how this was created. And I think this is only going to go further into hospitality by saying, would we want to be a destination for people to just come and stay, or are we looking at ourselves as a destination for people to come, stay, and evolve? And I think if you look at that, the latter part of it, of stay and evolve, is where we're going to be hitting on to. So some facets of how business ready we as hospitality have become. As Isthara Parks, the company that I'm a co-founder of, what did we do? In the last 30 days, the hallmarks of Isthara changed. 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, if somebody came to me and asked me a question saying, what is Isthara? I would have said, we do great housekeeping services, we do food, we do community platforms, we help people network, etc., etc. And we also have an ability for them to socialize and have a community effect as a whole, apart from the amenities that we provide in our community living. The last 30 days has changed it. And today, the 4 hallmarks of Isthara is defined as weekly. It is one hallmark where we have a very high level of sanitation and hygiene, which we've never thought about in sanitation and hygiene format. We've always thought about it as housekeeping 30 to 45 days ago. Now that's housekeeping is out of the window. The new buzzword is sanitation and hygiene. Then we look at We Social. We used to have club nights. We used to organize for our co-living, group yogas, etc., etc., etc. All those are gone. Social distancing norms in play. How are we going to redefine the community effect? Community has to stay, but the community is more online than offline today. So we are creating a platform called We Social, where continuous learning, activities that we want to send across to our residents, etc., etc., are on this platform of We Social. Then we looked at We Eat. Again, are people going to sit together in few hundreds and eat together? Maybe yes, maybe not. I think more and more people are going to be skeptic to the fact of basically being in groups, and that fear is bound to stay for some time. How are we going to redefine this eating process to make sure it's a different experience? So we have the third hallmark called We Eat, in terms of how people can order systems, order food and take away food to their rooms, etc., etc. And then we had something for our employees called We Learn. Traditional training. Our training manager used to bring everybody in, sit together, have a classroom of 20 to 25 people, and start teaching to every single person in the room. That has changed. So now we are looking at hosting training videos for all our housekeeping staff, new joinees, into YouTube, a private channel in YouTube, and how they can see it and learn it from wherever they are. So if it is going to be about bed making, if it's about cleaning a table, it's about serving something in, or it's about folding a piece of a towel, these video experiences now are the new norm, that every employee who joins us now is asked to see it, do an online test himself, and move forward from there. So these transactions of basically having a training manager into play, inviting people for getting trained, all that is gone. So in a nutshell, I've covered various topics of how hospitality is impacted. As a student, if I'm going to be putting in terms of my closing words, I think what is very important is dynamic adaptability, on how fast you all see this as a potential opportunity to right skill, and I repeat those words, to right skill yourselves to make sure you're future ready and your business ready. Number 2, what are those entrepreneurial ideas that you're bringing to the table today which are likely to disrupt the businesses of the future, especially hospitality? What can you bring to the table today that can disrupt in terms of technology, in terms of idea, or in terms of model of business, which is very, very less on fixed costs, that will help hospitality, which in turn helps a lot more people. But the most important aspect of it is basically our ability to ensure we're using a combination of all these components to make sure we're future ready, which means how fast are we embracing ourselves to take these off, reevaluate ourselves, and once this crisis is done, are we the first ones who are going to go out and say, yes, this has happened, but now I'm open for business again. I'm right skilled again. With that, I'll leave it up to you. Happy to take any questions. I wish us all the very best and wish you guys the very best in future too. Thank you.
Very nicely put out, Krishna. Brilliant flow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I do have a couple of questions to begin with.
Yeah.
Do you think the business model, which is relying on asset-free model, are going to survive in the future?
Asset-free model is going to survive more in the future. I think why I think the asset-free model is going to survive more in future is I think this whole shared economy is going to go to a different level. When we are talking about shared economy going to a different level, quite a lot of emphasis is also in terms of how these assets can be shared. For example, the rentals, for example, various other touch points of what we could see. I think there's going to be a convergence in a very big way. We have started seeing this to a certain degree. And I think today, fixed cost is an aversion for most people, simply because of the fact that there is an inability and an unknown component of business that has come in. For last 30 years, we had something called as a force majeure on all contracts. In the last 30 days, most companies have learned more about force majeure than what they have learned in the last 30 years. So I think there is a fundamental shift to it. Absolute fundamental shift to it.
Okay. Looking at the MICE segment, of course, you also touched upon. So looking at the MICE segment, millions and millions of square meters of assets have been created already. Okay, and put them into altogether a different use right now may not be possible. So how do you look at this scenario?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges in hospitality that's going to come into play. The MICE, as I told you today, the MICE players are the last players who are going to come standing in this whole sector, and those assets have to be used for something else. So we've got to repurpose those assets in terms of the destination that we are looking at. So if I had a great MICE asset in New York, is my rental ratio for that asset better off as an office workplace? Am I better off in creating a better hospital to it? Am I going to have more of a virtual learning center that's coming into it? What am I adapting myself in terms of what the future needs are to do it? Am I likely going to have 50,000 people in my ballroom again? Not in the near future. So how is that ballroom going to be converted? Am I going to rent it out to an office? Maybe. Maybe I use that as offices for the future. Maybe I use it as shared offices for the future. Maybe I use it as a warehouse. You know, you've got manufacturing capabilities where warehouses are required. So it's a very deep question that the MICE players have been posed today more than everybody else in hospitality. And to be honest, none of us have an answer for it as yet. I think the process of that getting evolved will, and I think more and more you're going to see that these assets are going to get distressed. There's going to be a lot of defaults in the market, and these are going to be repurposed into something else in the future.
Okay. Coming back to your business, I mean, basically you have been into co-living space. You have been into hostel management space, if I'm right. And
yes. Well, co-living and student housing. We have two.
Students, yeah. Co-living and students hostel management. Am I right? Okay. Let me talk about the co-living to begin with. I mean, co-living, basically you are looking at the target segment, which is quite sensitive about the so-called social distancing, or now people are calling it as physical distancing. Okay, if that be the case, the number of people who are going to opt for co-living is going to drastically come down in the days to come. How do you look at this?
I have an opposite view on that.
Yeah,
I think the demand for co-living is going to shoot through the roof.
Okay.
And why we are saying that is there are quite a few reasons for that. Number one is 98% of the co-living market is presently being managed by unbranded players. The unbranded players basically, they are mom and pop stores who do not have a set standard, etc., etc. So a guy who's basically working in Microsoft today, Microsoft till 50 days ago did not care for where this guy stayed.
Yeah.
But today, he's a threat who can bring a virus to Microsoft. So today, Microsoft cares.
Yeah.
So they want to go more and more to branded players, saying, do they have physical distancing or social distancing incorporated as their business model? Is sanitation of the highest levels, etc., etc.? What are the checks and balances that they're creating? So this rental housing, so what is co-living, is one component of the rental housing market. That rental housing market is there to stay. More and more people are going to adapt to this rental market. So co-living by itself might change in one form where the number of square feet per person will increase. So if I had, say, 35 to 40 square feet per person before allocated, today I have to allocate 60 square feet to a person. So the cost dynamics will change. The business dynamics will change. The core dynamics remain, but the pricing dynamics will change. That's what is likely to change.
Okay. Thank you. Students, please.
Sir, I'm Lokeshwaran from DJME.
Hi, Lokeshwaran.
Good morning, sir. Nice to hear you.
Thank you.
Do you think how will co-working space will be, the company who renting the co-working space will be impacted, and how they need to adapt in terms of technology to survive?
Yeah. So I think, there are two spectrum of thoughts when it comes to co-working. There is one school of thought who basically are very bullish that co-working will start gearing more because of the fact that the social distancing policies in the offices will come in. Most BPOs and more ITS companies who basically had the workstations right next to each other will no longer be allowed to do that as per government norms. The social distancing will mean that there is 6 to 7 feet distance between two working people, which means the need for space increases. When the need for space increases, we also talked about most of the companies being asset light. Is a company going to go back and rent more spaces and furnish those more spaces? I don't think so. I think that's where co-working comes into play. Co-working has that ready-made availability of workstations and facilities for these corporates to readily embrace, with no fixed cost at all. So one school of thought is that is going to have a huge demand in future, where people are moving more and more in terms of ensuring that there is enough square feet per person. The second school of thought is more moderate. The second school of thought, what comes across is basically saying the work from home culture will start. So more companies will start thinking to say, well, we've had people being at home for about 90 days, and we've had a lot of roles performing from homes for 90 days. Did they really bring value by coming to the office? Do they really bring value by coming to a co-working space? Or are we better off in saving that cost and letting them work from home and come and meet us once in 2 weeks with whatever reportings that they have to? I think that's a school of thought which is working very well too, to say there is a significant cost per person that is reduced by allowing them to work from home with certain parameters of checks and controls, of course. But I think on one school of thought is that work from home is going to raise up in future because it has been successfully tested for about 60 to 90 days. The other school of thought is we will start seeing co-working spaces increasing because the corporates have to start giving more space to their employees, which means the demand for real estate is more. So co-working comes with no fixed cost for these corporates, and they would take it. So what is my personal apprehension of it? I have apprehensions on both, but where I see opportunity is I think you're going to see something in between both. You're going to see an uptake in co-working spaces. You're also going to look at few or more of these resources which are going to be working from home, thereby saving that fixed cost to the companies.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, good morning. This is Sriraman, faculty from DJME.
Yes, sir.
It was a wonderful talk, sir. Thank you so much for that. Really, you have covered in depth the hospitality industry. My question is, sir, I have two questions. One is, as you mentioned earlier, that now it's going to be shared economy in the hospitality industry. So can we see going forward where OYOs will dominate a lot of hotel rooms. That is one. Second one is now the hospitality is in a crisis. At least for 2-3 months, we can't see people going to hotels. And maybe once things are settled down, they will have to go for a push strategy from the hospital industry. Can we see some a new business model emerging, like travel companies and hotel chains joining hands together, maybe local level, regional level, national level, to promote the business?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I think I'll just take your first question first. Are we going to see more OYO models? I think OYO was a specific example for a certain segment of business that they were catering to. They were looking at consolidating the budget segment of Indian hospitality, and they attempted to do this in the other parts of the world as well. So that's a very small, very minuscule part of this overall hospitality segment of what we see in it. How is this model going to go forward? The fundamental way this model is going to go forward, as I said, is in terms of re-evaluating the cost of real estate. I think, are we going to have lobbies in future hotels on the ground floor? Maybe not. You're going to have retail spaces there. They're going to start redoing in terms of how they're thinking as revenues per square feet that they're earning. So the business model is going to tweak. You would have restaurants being outsourced to restaurant players, opposed to hotels taking restaurants and running it as their restaurants, having a fixed cost to it, investing in it, etc., etc. So I think what you will start seeing as a disruption in the hospitality industry in the short term is experts take over their domains of experiences. So I think that's the initial disruption. The second disruption is about in terms of supply chain and delivery management. I as an F&B player, I need customers. I need to have more seats per restaurant. Is that going to happen in future? No, it's not going to happen. So how am I going to reach the market without the market reaching me? So that's where I think the second level of disruption comes in. How is the product given to a consumer without the consumer coming to you? E-com has successfully demonstrated it. A lot of other players, even companies like Licious, Swiggy, Zomato, they've successfully disrupted this market. There is already a platform that exists for hospitality companies to bear off, except that, as I said, the hotels have been very traditional in their thought process that they never want to try everything. They always took it for granted. So that part of it is going to get disrupted. And how is the travel pattern going to change of a consumer? At this moment of time, none of us know how the consumer is going to behave 6 months later. What is going to happen 6 months later? What is the trend in 6 months? None of us have an idea. But whatever happens then, the adaptability of that particular scenario will start happening. So I think there are 3 components to your first question, which I've answered. The second aspect is travel companies are extinct. They're out of business. They're gone. The biggest travel agency in the world, Thomas Cook, last year filed bankruptcy. And December 2019, they shut down operations after about 100 years of thing. So the whole destination management companies, travel agencies, travel companies are history now. That's already replaced by online aggregators. So whether it's the Booking.com or the Expedia or the Make My Trip, they've already successfully eliminated that whole travel agencies, etc., etc. Their history anymore. How are the partnership between and for these aggregators to survive? The primary commodity is hotels. So for an aggregator, they are not manufacturing anything, or they are not the end level service provider. They are aggregating a service provider. So if the service providers are not surviving, aggregators don't survive as well. So are you going to see both of them coming together? Definitely yes. Absolutely. Booking.com, Expedia, Make My Trip, etc., etc., are going to be working much more closely with hospitality to ensure it's a joint survival. Because hotels can survive without aggregators. Aggregators or any other companies cannot survive without hotels. So end service providers are going to redefine what they are doing. These aggregators and these travel companies are going to adapt to what the future of this hospitality is going to be. And that's the way I see the future.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Well explained.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. I'm Siddharth, student at BG Academy.
Yes, please. Hi, Siddharth.
Sir, how you are going to change the service costing decisions, sir, after the COVID-19?
is your question, how am I going to change the service costings?
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. So if I've understood your question right, service costings is basically the cost of landing a service to a consumer. Is that what your question is?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So see, costing is the last, is probably the last priority in everybody's minds at the moment. What is a cost? The cost is basically all of what you are delivering put together and passed to a customer. The customer has a choice of whether to accept your cost or not accept your cost. If your cost is not accepted, you're going to rework in terms of how your service model is and adapt to the cost that your customer is going to be there. So today, I think it is not about costings that anybody is worried about. Today, what we are worried about is basically in terms of sustenance of the business model opposed to costs. So what do I mean by a business model? So how am I going to reach the customer? How is the customer going to reach me? That is the primary point of today's discussion, which needs a solution. Once this is clearly defined, and once this is clearly mapped, and once everybody understands in terms of how you are going to reach a customer and a customer is going to reach you, you're going to work backwards in terms of how these costs are driven. So cost is just the components of what goes into service. So at this moment of time, I think it's premature to talk about service costs. I think it's more important to talk about service design on how the customer is going to take your services and what is the ability of you to serve your customer. That will determine your cost. So cost to me is not of a key priority area to look at until and unless the services mechanism and the route to market is defined.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.